part 6 of The Tower of Babylon by Ted Chiang. I think I can finish the story from here. At the rear of the room on the right-hand side, the miners burned out a narrow, upward-sloping corridor, and in the floor in front of the chamber entrance, they dug a downward-sloping channel into the floor. Thus, there was a smooth, continuous ramp that cut across the floor immediately in front of the entrance and ended just to its left. On this ramp, the Egyptians loaded the block of granite. They dragged and pushed the block up into the side corridor where it just barely fit and popped it in place with a stack of flat mud bricks braced against the bottom of the left wall like a pillar lying on the ramp. With the sliding stone to hold back the waters, it was safe for the miners to continue tunneling. If they broke into a reservoir and the waters of heaven began pouring down into the tunnel, they would break the bricks one by one and the stone would slide down until it rested in the recess in the floor, utterly blocking the doorway. If the waters flooded in with such force that they washed men out of the tunnels, the mud bricks would gradually dissolve and again the stone would slide down. The waters would be retained and the miners could then begin a new tunnel in another direction to avoid the reservoir. The miners again used fire setting to continue the tunnel, beginning at the far end of the room. To aid the circulation of air within the vault, ox hides were stretched on tall frames of wood and placed obliquely on either side of the tunnel entrance at the top of the tower. Thus, the steady wind that blew underneath the vault of heaven was guided upward into the tunnel. It kept the fire blazing and it cleared the air after the fire was extinguished so that the miners could dig without breathing smoke. The Egyptians did not stop working once the sliding stone was in place. While the miners swung their picks at the tunnel's end, the Egyptians labored at the task of cutting a stair into the solid stone to replace the wooden steps. This they did with wooden wedges, and the blocks they removed from the sloping floor left steps in their place. Thus the miners worked, extending the tunnel on and on. The tunnel always ascended, though it reversed direction regularly like a thread in a giant stitch, so that its path was straight up. They built other sliding door rooms so that only the uppermost segment of the tunnel would be flooded in case they penetrated a reservoir. They cut channels in the vault surface from which they could hang walkways and platforms. Starting from these platforms, well away from the tower, they dug side tunnels which joined the main tunnel deep inside. The wind was guided through these to provide ventilation, clearing the smoke from deep inside the tunnel. For years, the labor continued. The pulling crews no longer hauled bricks, but wood and water for the fire setting. People came to inhabit those tunnels just inside the vault's surface, and on hanging platforms they grew downward bearing vegetables. The miners lived there at the border of heaven. Some married and raised children. Few ever set foot on earth again. With a wet cloth wrapped around his face, Hillelum climbed down from the wooden steps onto stone, having just fed some more wood to the bonfire at the tunnel's end. The fire would continue for many hours, and he would wait in the lower tunnels where the wind was not thick with smoke. Then there was the distant sound of a shattering, the sound of a mountain of stone being split through, and then a steadily growing roar. And then A torrent of water came rushing down the tunnel. For a moment, Hilalum was frozen in horror. The water, shockingly cold, slammed into his legs, knocking him down. He rose to his feet, gasping for breath, leaning against the current, clutching at the steps. They had hit a reservoir. He had to descend below the highest sliding door before it was closed. His legs wished to leap down the steps, but he knew he couldn't remain on his feet if he did, and being swept down by the raging current would likely batter him to death. Going as fast as he dared, he took the steps one by one. He slipped several times, sliding down as many as a dozen steps. The stone steps scraped against his back, but he felt no pain. All the while, he was certain the tunnel would collapse and crush him, or else the entire vault would split open and the sky would gape beneath his feet, and he would fall down to earth amidst the heavenly rain. Yahweh's punishment had come. A second deluge. How much further until he reached the sliding stone? The tunnel seemed to stretch on, and the waters were pouring down even faster now. He was virtually running down the steps. Suddenly he stumbled and splashed into shallow water. He had run down past the end of the stairs and fallen into the room of the sliding stone, and there was water higher than his knees. He stood up, and he saw Damika and Anui, two fellow miners, just noticing him. They stood in front of the stone that already blocked the exit. "No!" he cried. "They closed it!" screamed Damika. "They did not wait." "Are there others coming?" shouted Anui without hope. "We may be able to move the block." "There are no others," answered Hilalum. "Can they push it from the other side?" "They cannot hear us." Anui pounded the granite with a hammer, making not a sound against the din of the water. Hilalum looked around the tiny room, only now noticing that an Egyptian floated face down in the water. "He died falling down the stairs," yelled Damika. "Is there nothing we can do?" Anui looked upward. "Yahweh, spare us." The three of them stood in the rising water, praying desperately. But Hilalum knew that it was in vain. His fate had come at last. Yahweh had not asked men to build the tower or to pierce the vault. The decision to build it belonged to men alone, and they would die in this endeavor, just as they did in any of their earthbound tasks. Their righteousness could not save them from the consequences of their deeds. The water reached their chests. "Let us ascend," shouted Hilalum. They climbed the tunnel laboriously against the onrush as the water rose behind their heels. The few torches illuminating the tunnel had been extinguished so that they ascended in the dark, murmuring prayers that they couldn't hear. The wooden steps at the top of the tunnel had dislodged from their place and were jammed farther down the tunnel. They climbed past them until they reached the smooth stone slope, and they waited for the water to carry them higher. They waited without words, their prayers exhausted. Hilalum imagined that he stood in the black gullet of Yahweh as the mighty one drank deep of the waters of heaven, ready to swallow the sinners. The water rose and bore them up until Hilalum could reach up with his hands and touch the ceiling. The giant fissure from which the waters gushed was right next to him. Only a tiny pocket of air remained. Hilalum shouted, "When this chamber is filled, we can swim heavenward." He could not tell if they heard him. He gulped his last breath as the water reached the ceiling and swam up into the fissure. He would die closer to heaven than any man had ever before. The fissure extended for many cubits. As soon as Hilolam passed through, the stone stratum slipped from his fingers and his flailing limbs touched nothing. For a moment he felt a current carrying him, but then he was no longer sure. With only blackness around him, he once again felt that horrible vertigo that he had experienced when first approaching the vault. He could not distinguish any directions, not even up or down. He pushed and kicked against the water, but did not know if he moved. Helpless, he was perhaps floating in still water, perhaps swept furiously by a current. All he felt was numbing cold. Never did he see any light. Was there no surface to this reservoir that he might rise to? Then he was slammed into stone again. His hands felt a crack in the surface. Was he back where he had begun? He was being forced into it, and he had no strength to resist. He was drawn into the tunnel and was rattled against its sides. It was incredibly deep, like the longest mine shaft. He felt as if his lungs would burst, but there was still no end to the passage. Finally, his breath would not be held any longer, and it escaped from his lips. He was drowning, and the blackness around him entered his lungs. But suddenly the walls opened out away from him. He was being carried along by a rushing stream of water. He felt air above the water, and then he felt no more. Hilolam awoke with his face pressed against wet stone. He could see nothing, but he could feel water near his hands. He rolled over and groaned. Every limb ached. He was naked, and much of his skin was scraped raw or wrinkled from wetness. But he breathed air. Time passed, and finally he could stand. Water flowed rapidly about his ankles. Stepping in one direction, the water deepened. In the other, there was dry stone, shale by the feel of it. It was utterly dark, like a mine without torches. With torn fingertips, he felt his way along the floor until it rose up and became a wall, slowly, like some blind creature. He crawled back and forth. He found the water's source, a large opening in the floor. He remembered. He had been spewed up from the reservoir through this hole. He continued crawling for what seemed like hours. If he was in a cavern, it was immense. He found a place where the floor rose in a slope. Was there a passage leading upward? Perhaps it could still take him to heaven. Hilolam crawled, having no idea how much time passed, not caring that he would never be able to retrace his steps, for he could not return whence he had come. He followed upward tunnels when he found them, downward ones when he had to. Though earlier he had swallowed more water than he would have thought possible, he began to feel thirst and hunger. And eventually he saw light and raced to the outside. The light made his eyes squeeze closed, and he fell to his knees, his fists clenched before his face. Was it the radiance of Yahweh? Could his eyes bear to see it? Minutes later he could open them, and he saw desert. He had emerged from a cave in the foothills of some mountains, and rocks and sand stretched to the horizon. Was heaven just like earth? Did Yahweh dwell in a place such as this? Or was this merely another realm within Yahweh's creation, another earth above his own, while Yahweh dwelled still higher? A sun lay near the mountaintops behind his back. Was it rising or falling? Were there days and nights here? Hillelum squinted at the sandy landscape. A line moved along the horizon. Was it a caravan? He ran to it, shouting with his parched throat until his need for breath stopped him. A figure at the end of the caravan saw him and brought the entire line to a stop. Hillelum kept running. The one who had seen him seemed to be a man, not spirit, and was dressed like a desert crosser. He had a water skin ready. Hillelum drank as best he could, panting for breath. Finally, he returned it to the man and gasped, "Where is this place?" "Were you attacked by bandits? We are headed to Erech." Hillelum stared. "Would you deceive me?" he shouted. The man drew back and watched him as if he were mad from the sun. Hillelum saw another man in the caravan walking over to investigate. "Erech is in the Shinar." "Yes, it is." "Were you not traveling to Shinar?" The other man stood ready with his staff. I was in... Hillelum stopped. "Do you know Babylon?" "Oh, that is your destination?" "That is north of Erech. It is an easy journey between them." "The tower, have you heard of it?" "Certainly. The pillar to heaven. It is said men at the top are tunneling through the vault of heaven." Hillelum fell to the sand. "Are you unwell?" The two caravan drivers mumbled to each other and went off to confer with the others. Hillelum was not watching them. He was in Shinar. He had returned to the earth. He had climbed above the reservoirs of heaven and arrived back at the earth. Had Yahweh brought him to this place to keep him from reaching any further above? Yet Hillelum still hadn't seen any signs, any indication that Yahweh noticed him. He had not experienced any miracle that Yahweh had performed to place him here. As far as he could see, he had merely swum up from the vault and entered the cavern below. Somehow the vault of heaven lay beneath the earth. It was as if they lay against each other, though they were separated by many leagues. How could that be? How could such distant places touch? Hillelum's head hurt, trying to think about it. And then it came to him. A seal cylinder. When rolled upon a tablet of soft clay, the carved cylinder left an imprint that formed a picture. Two figures might appear at opposite ends of the tablet, though they stood side by side on the surface of the cylinder. All the world was such a cylinder. Men imagine heaven and earth as being at the ends of a tablet with sky and stars stretched between. Yet, the world was wrapped around in some fantastic way so that heaven and earth touched. It was clear now why Yahweh had not struck down the tower, had not punished men for wishing to reach beyond the bounds set for them. For the longest journey would merely return them to the place where they'd come. Centuries of their labor would not reveal to them any more of creation than they already knew. Yet through their endeavor, men would glimpse the unimaginable artistry of Yahweh's work in seeing how ingeniously the world had been constructed. By this construction, Yahweh's work was indicated, and Yahweh's work was concealed. Thus would men know their place. Hilalam rose to his feet, his legs unsteady from awe, and sought out the caravan drivers. He would go back to Babylon. Perhaps he would see Lugadim again. He would send word to those on the tower. He would tell them about the shape of the world. And that is the end of the story. Thanks for watching.